for it. Come on. There we go. All right. Put that over there. Get that monitor, the laptop in view. All right. Technology. It does wonderful things, but it does mean more buttons to push. In the old days, you could just show up, open up a book, and start. Now we reach more, we do more, it's preserved more, but we have to fiddle more. I hope everyone's doing well this evening. I'm just going to give a couple seconds for people to log in either through the YouTube or through the Zoom. Then we'll be ready to go in just a second. Don't want to wait too long so that I can respect those who have shown up early. I mean, early meaning on time. All right. Well, I think that has given us enough of a buffer. And so I'm going to go ahead and get us started on our topic for tonight. And our topic for tonight is Purim, the holiday that's coming up just a couple weeks away. And it is one of the most fabulous, fun holidays. It is also the last holiday. It is the last holiday in the cycle of holiday months. We've mentioned before, or if I haven't mentioned to this group, I've definitely mentioned in other videos. The beginning of the holiday cycle is in Pesach, which is in spring, and the end of the holiday cycle is in Purim, which is late winter, just before spring begins. So this is coming full circle and bringing us to a new level before we begin the cycle again. And Purim, as you'll see, is a very fun holiday with a very serious message and a lot of very important content, opportunities for doing mitzvot, for doing the commandments, as well as for spiritual growth. So, with that as our introduction, let's get things underway. Oh, and my mouse is scrolling too fast. There we go. So, first of all, we have to talk about the story, because Purim is a very story-centered holiday. Just like the holiday of Pesach, which is the first holiday, Purim is also very story-focused. But it is a long time after the Pesach holiday, 1,500, 2,000 years, give or take, and the holiday picks up when things are not so great for us. It picks up after the fall of Jerusalem, which was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, excuse me. And after that destruction of the Jewish community in Israel, we were taken into captivity and brought into the land of Babylon. Now, Babylon would mostly be associated with the modern day country of Iraq. Babylon itself would eventually fall to the Persians. The Persian was the next empire over, and as it grew, it eventually dominated the Babylonians, and the Persians took over their territory, including not only us, who were mostly living in the land of Babylon, but also us, meaning the few people who were left either in the land of Israel or in other parts of the Babylonian Empire. And the Persians would eventually occupy all of that territory, indeed, even go further into the land of Egypt and all the way down towards Ethiopia, we are told. So that meant that it basically covered the entire known Jewish world and Jewish population at the time. And the Persian Empire was a very diverse empire, and it was a very, as far as empires go, tolerant empire, meaning that it allowed people to live more or less as they wanted to live, as long as they were loyal to Persia, followed the Persian rules, political rules. They could keep on with their own religion, their own local culture, their own local practices. And as such, the Persians allowed us to return in large number to our land. However, many Jews chose to remain in the different parts of the Persian Empire, in particular in the land of Persia itself, which is in modern day Iran, and in the city of Susa, also known as Shushan in Hebrew, which was the Persian capital during the time of this story. And we're going to talk about trying to nail down exactly what the time frame is for this a little bit later on. But for the moment, just use this as your background and don't worry too much about the precise year that this occurred. So I want to give you a quick summary. Of course, if you want the full story, you're going to have to read the book of Esther, from which the story and the holiday are taken. The book of Esther is in the section of the Jewish Bible, the Tanakh, known as Ketuvim, known as the writings. It's all of 10 chapters. We read it on the holiday of Purim, as we'll go over in much more detail later on in this discussion. So let's get to the summary of the story for those that are not familiar with it. It begins with the Persian emperor, or king as he is called in the Hebrew, and his name is Ahasuerus, or Ahasuerus, if you want to use the Greek version of his name. I'm going to use Ahasuerus mostly because I'm more familiar with it from the Hebrew, and because Ahasuerus always sounds just like whoosh to me, but it sounds good to Greeks, I suppose. So Ahasuerus wants to get rid of his current chief wife, his chief queen, whose name was Vashti. The details are there in chapter 1 of why he was unhappy because of her disobedience. So he has all of the pretty women brought to him in his capital, meaning essentially that this is a mass capture, kidnapping. Now, it's not kidnapping when the emperor does it, because the emperor is the law. That's one of the problems with totalitarian regimes. But this is actually a forced participation, if you will, in the competition to become the new chief wife. And in the process of this, a woman named Esther, or Hadassah, which is her Hebrew name, is brought to him, and she finds the most favor. Now, Esther, as she is known to the rest of the world, is also Hadassah, same name, and she is a Jewish woman. But she keeps her Jewish identity under wraps. She doesn't share that information with anyone else at the palace, let alone with her new husband. And instead, she simply says, "I'm Esther." Now, this is the first time we see of Jewish people having a name they use in the secular culture around them, and a name they use that is still connected to the Hebrew roots of our people. But this becomes commonplace as Jews spread across the world, where you will have a Hebrew name and you will have a secular French, German, or other name. This is part of the adaptation that is living a life in the diaspora, in the dispersal of Jews around the world. Now, Esther was given the advice to keep her heritage under wraps by Mordechai, who is variously understood to be both her uncle and cousin, and he seems to have a moderate position in the government of Persia. As you can imagine, the emperor cannot rule everything by himself. There is a vast bureaucracy of many different servants that work for the king in the administration. Mordechai appears to be one of these, of middling stature. He's definitely working at the palace. He is definitely rubbing elbows with some of the very important people, as we'll see, but he is not exactly on a first-name basis with the king. In the process of carrying out his duties, he overhears a conspiracy, a plot to assassinate the king, which was very, very common in the Persian times. Plots were just what people did for fun, I guess. But Mordechai tells the king and informs on the traitors. They are captured and executed, and the fact that he helped the king goes into the king's big book of People I Like. Remember that book. It's going to be important in just a minute. Everyone okay with the story so far? Okay. So we now see a change in the story where Ahasuerus appoints a new number 2 for the country, and that man's name is Haman, or Haman in the English version. Now, Haman is going to become the main villain of the story. And the main reason he is the villain is because Haman has ordered that everyone else in the country, except the king, has to bow down to him. This is his way of showing his power, his might, over the entire country, second only to the king. Mordecai chooses not to bow. Now, choice is an important word. It is often incorrectly claimed that Mordecai couldn't bow to Haman, but in fact, Mordecai could, under Jewish law, bow to a secular leader if that was the important point. He cannot bow, like any Jew can't, to an idol. He cannot bow to a person who claims to be a god, but to a secular power who merely claims to have secular authority. Indeed, Jews bow all the time. If you go to the United Kingdom and you see Jews who are in the government of Her Majesty the Queen, they will bow to her as perfectly normal practice. Our tradition goes into many discussions of why he didn't bow, but that's beyond the scope of the story tonight. Let's just say for the moment that his refusal sets up a power struggle between him and Haman. And Haman decides that he is going to solve this problem of Mordecai not bowing by executing not only Mordecai, but all of the Jewish people. As I mentioned before, Persia was a multi-ethnic state, and to have people who come from different ethnicities usually meant to be tolerant. However, it also meant that if you were to harm somebody from one ethnicity, you would probably be very worried that the other members of that ethnicity, nation, people, or group would want revenge on you. So Haman is using the full power of his office to try and convince the king to wipe out the entire Jewish nation so that he doesn't have to worry about this. Now, traditionally, he is also said to be a descendant from the Amalekites, and the Amalekites were historically very important in the exodus from Egypt as a group that attacked us in a very cowardly and very pointless way, trying to simply murder for the sake of murder. So if he is descended from the Amalekites, certainly that makes sense. Now, this gets a lot of alarm when they see that the king is going along with this plan, that he has allowed himself to be convinced by a bribe to go along with this wholesale slaughter. They are worried. And obviously, Mordecai turns to Esther and asks her to help, but Esther is concerned. Not only is her identity secret, but you can't just walk up to the king and ask a favor. You need to be summoned to the king, and it's been a while since she's been summoned. Nevertheless, she chooses to go of her own will to the king, and when she goes to the king, she is putting her life on the line. Remember, this is not like seeking an appointment with a president or a prime minister. This was seeking an appointment with somebody who literally could murder you if he just didn't like the way you were dressed. So she risks it all. She goes, and he doesn't kill her. Yay! And she sets up a plan to trap Haman. We'll come back to that plan a little bit more, but for the moment, all she is saying is she wants the king and Haman, just the two of them, to come to a party. This is the second party we've seen. The events of the very first incident with Vashti, the first queen, also took place at a party. And this becomes sort of a important touch point throughout the story. Haman, despite being overjoyed that he has been asked to this party by the queen, is very unhappy when Mordecai still isn't bowing. And so he decides to go to the party in a good mood, having asked the king for permission to kill Mordecai in advance. And so he goes to the king to get that permission. But remember, he can't just walk in on the king. He has to wait until he is summoned. So he is hanging out in the lobby, if you will, hoping that the king will choose to invite him in. Now, at the same time that Haman is getting eagerly is hoping to murder Mordecai, Achashverosh, who is having trouble sleeping, is sitting down and having the story read to him of people who have done good things for him. Remember that book I mentioned of the book of people who the king likes? Well, here he's reading from it, He finds out that Mordecai had helped him. He thinks, wow, that Mordecai guy, how nice. It's good to have allies that actually try to save my life rather than kill me. What do we do to honor him? And the bureaucracy says, well, actually, Mordecai didn't get any reward or honor at all. Aha, says the king, we need to fix that. But, as is common for the character of Ahasuerus throughout the story, he doesn't do anything without asking other people's opinions because he's not exactly a kind of guy who can make his own decisions. And so he says, who's out there that I can get some information from? And Haman, of course, is waiting. So the king invites him in. He says to Haman, I want to help somebody. I want to honor them. Haman thinks, well, who's he going to honor except me? It's like almost a sitcom level of misunderstanding. And so he gives him advice that is incredibly gracious and generous of what the king should do for the person, only to find out that Mordecai is the person, and Haman himself is going to have to be part of the honoring of Mordecai by leading the horse as he walks through the street. This is incredibly humiliating to Haman. Haman begins to realize that he's in a bad way if Mordecai has this status. And even as he is trying to figure out what to do from having had this problem, he is brought to the next party for the queen. And at that party, Esther reveals her Jewish identity. Haman's day just got worse because now he realizes that the favorite of the king, the favorite queen, is the same religious and ethnic identity as the man who was just honored in the streets for saving the life of the king. And Haman has been plotting to kill all of them. The king doesn't exactly take this well. He eventually bursts into anger because that's the only way he can make up his mind. And he orders that Haman be executed. And he gives permission, and yes, it needed permission for the Jews to defend themselves against the coming attack by Haman's co-conspirators, the thousands of people across the empire that were all getting ready to attack the Jews and take all of their loot. So when those people show up to attack, the Jews defend themselves and they kill the attackers. They kill all of the co-conspirators, but do not take any loot. Instead, we establish a new holiday as Esther becomes permanently established as a very important figure in the kingdom, and as Mordecai becomes permanently established as a very important number two to the king. The Jews are overjoyed, and we celebrate that day, the day we were going to be killed, as a day of celebration ever since. That is the very short version of the story of Esther. Questions or comments before we get into what we do from here and how this has been carried on into our present day? And also, of course, the historical links of this. Remember, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question, or if you're on the YouTube, you can always type it in the chat, and I will do my best to get to it when I can. Okay, so what is going on with this story? Because you may notice that one of the things that I didn't mention throughout the entire retelling is God. In fact, famously, the book of Esther is the only book in the entire Tanakh, the entire Bible, that doesn't have the name of God in it. So instead, what our tradition tells us that we should notice that is happening in the book of Esther is that there is a hiddenness to God's presence that we have to work harder in order to uncover. But we still have faith that there will be a salvation, a rescue, a deliverance in this time. And indeed, taken from chapter 4 of the book of Esther, the words of Mordecai come as follows. Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. Meaning, don't think that you can survive the massacre that Haman has plotted. You're probably going to get it too. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter. There'll be some other form of deliverance, while you and your father's house will perish. Meaning, we're going to be saved somehow, but you, if you refuse to help us, you're probably going to fall away. And who knows, perhaps you have attained to royal position for just such a crisis. Maybe that's why you were chosen to be queen. Maybe it was God's way of putting the right people in the right places to make our deliverance as easy as possible. And indeed, Esther takes this and goes to the king with that inspiration. But you'll notice that this is very different than the story of Pesach, which, as I mentioned, is the first holiday in the cycle of holidays, the yearly cycle. In that holiday, the holiday of Passover, God is everywhere. I mean, it is just impossible to turn a page, even a paragraph, without mentioning God and the very, very explicit, overt, amazingly undeniable miracles that are happening left, right, and center. Here, like I said, the presence of God is not as flashy, it's not as overt, yet nevertheless we can see that these thousands of years later from the Exodus, the Jews have, even in their exile, internalized that God will protect and save them. That doesn't mean there isn't going to be trouble. We already know there's trouble in the story at this point. That doesn't mean that there won't be loss of life and suffering. We know that that happens. But it does mean that ultimately we will be spared from any permanent or full destruction. And the choice is up to us of how we participate in that salvation, rather than will there be salvation. And to choose to participate in what you can do, to see yourself as uniquely situated at any point in life to do some good, that it becomes sort of the pattern for Jewish self-perception as individuals and as a nation for the centuries that follow. And it comes down to this idea that here God is not holding our hand, here God is not lighting a pillar of fire in front of us like he did at the Exodus, but instead we have matured thanks to God's teachings from that whole cycle of holidays that we reenact, but also of our whole history that we retell. We have matured to the point where we know what must be done. We know that we can do it. All that is left is to choose to actually do it and make it happen. And like I said, this is where we begin to walk on our own feet with a little bit more confidence and understanding of the world, and understanding that it is up to us to act in these ways. But did it happen? Okay, this is the question that everybody always likes to ask me. And the answer is probably. Now, this is our telling of an episode of Persian history that mattered a lot to us. It didn't really matter to anyone else. The total number of people who were killed in the conspiracy was quite small. The number of people, Haman may have been important for a while, but that doesn't mean anything. But who was Ahasuerus? Because we don't have any Persian kings that are named Ahasuerus, right? We got Cyrus, we got Cambyses, we got Darius, we have Xerxes, we have Artaxerxes, except all the names that we use in English for the different Persian kings, and which you'll often see in many translations, are the Greek names. That is to say, they are the English version of the Greek version of the Persian version of the actual name. So if we look at the Persian names, then we can actually see that Ahasuerus is most similar to, and I apologize to how I pronounce my Persian, Chishayarsha, which may not sound exactly like Ahasuerus, but in the Aramaic version of the Persian, because those are two different languages, it would be something like Harshirsha, and or Hashirash, which, as you can see from the actual Hebrew version, Ahasuerus, is very, very similar, except for some minor changes of vowels, which, as you'll hopefully be knowing from your Hebrew studies, or eventually will learn, the vowels in Hebrew are extremely flexible, especially when you are bringing in loan words from a different language. So it would seem likely that Ahasuerus is best identified with Xerxes by name. But we still have to look into the Persian records to see if there is an Esther anywhere and whether she's important. Well, we don't find an actual Esther. However, if we begin to do a little math, we can narrow it down to who it might be and then find out. So when we look at Persian inscriptions for Chishayarsha, or Yarasha, we see that he ruled from Hidush to Kushia, which are the equivalents of Hodu and Kush, India to Ethiopia, which is exactly the terms that are used in the opening line of the Megillah. We know that Xerxes reigned from 486 to 465 BCE because the Persians kept good records of that. And we know that from the Megillah that the first party that happens, the party where Vashti is out and a new king, a new woman is then sought after a while, we know that that party then would have been in the third year of his reign, meaning 489 BCE. When you look at the 483 BCE, because we're counting towards ourselves, I have to update that typo. We know from the Megillah as well that Esther was chosen then in the winter of the 7th year, taken from chapter 2. That then would move us up to 479 BCE. Now, what happened in 479 BCE in Xerxes' life? Well, Xerxes returned from his failed invasion of Greece. That is very, very famous for the story of the Greeks, but this is now the story on the other side of the Aegean Sea. He would have returned to the palace of Darius, the palace that had been built in the place known as Susa, which, wouldn't you know, is also the same place, Shushan, as it is written in the Hebrew. So we have Xerxes having a reason to get back, having a reason why this year would be when he was picking a new wife, having a reason why he might need a little comfort and cheering up, to all happen in the year 479, and that was because of his failed invasion. And wouldn't you know it, according to Persian records, he absolutely ends up right in the city where our main events take place. Now, does that mean it's definitely 100% absolutely sure that this was the Persian emperor at the time? No. This is still speculation, because as I mentioned, our version was written to emphasize the things that were important to us and the message and meaning that we needed to understand and learn from. It was not written as a chronicle of Persian life or of Persian events. So things that might have been quite minor in the Persian scope of things are emphasized in our story, and things that we emphasize were not bothered to be recorded at all among the Persians. So we do not have a perfect one-to-one proof that this is exactly who and when the events happened, but it does fit extremely well. In addition, we do know that from Greek sources that Xerxes did have a wife called Amestris. Now, there are no Persian records of this, which is not unusual. Different Persian coups would often wipe out earlier records if they didn't like people. But there is no record in either the Persian or the Greeks of a wife called Vashti. Now, in order to understand this Amestris and why she is recounted in the Greek version of the records, you first have to remember that the Greeks, having been invaded by the Persians, are not fans of the Persians. They really despise them. And they describe Amestris as being a terrible and cruel queen who slaughtered her enemies. Sounds kind of like a woman who would have ordered that her people could defend themselves if told from a very different point of view. The Greeks also say that Amestris was born from a military commander by the name of Otanas, but they do not mention her being Jewish, which would not have been a significant detail for the Greeks, who were just more overwhelmed by the multiple ethnicities of the Persian Empire. However, we do know that Esther's father's name from the Megillah itself is Avichail. Now, Avichail literally translates to be, my father is a warrior. So the fact that Amestris was born from a military commander, that Esther's father's name is literally my dad's in the army, seems very plausible. Again, as Esther had a different name, Hadassah, so too it could have been that Otanas had a name for the public and Avichail for his private use. Again, we don't have 100%, but this is quite helpful supporting evidence for the idea that it was Xerxes and Amestris that were the main characters in the story. In case you're being bugged about the fact that the name Amestris does not match the name Esther, again, we have to go through our Greek, our English to Greek and Greek to Persian calculations. So Amestris, you see I've emphasized the consonants, which as I said before are more important. The is that is added is a Greek form, the same way that Xerxes gets an is form at the end. Different languages like to attach different suffixes to certain foreign words and especially names, so we can chop that off and expect that it was only added by the Greeks. That leaves us with our Amester. Well, the core letters of Esther, again the root consonants, are STR, or STR, and you can ignore the TH part of the Esther because that is just the English translation. There's no comparable TH sound in Hebrew. So we then have this Amester matching the stir, which is the identical root. Now the at the front is not an unusual letter to be added or deleted depending upon foreign language rules going from Hebrew to other languages or vice versa. So it is quite possible that this Amester is the Esther that we know and cheer during our story. One additional bit of evidence that supports this hypothesis is that Artaxerxes is the king who takes over after Xerxes, who would be most likely Esther's son, and Artaxerxes is the one who supported Ezra and Nehemiah in the land of Israel to help them finish the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem and to standardize, to formalize, and make it official the full Jewish control of the land of Israel. So if indeed Artaxerxes is from Amester and Xerxes, from Esther and Achashverosh, that would mean that technically he was Jewish, and it would not be surprising, even though he himself does not seem to have practiced Judaism, unfortunately, that he would want to support his mother's family in their attempt to come to a peaceful settlement in the land. All right, so that's a lot of history. I find it fascinating. Hopefully you didn't mind the digression too much. Ultimately, whether or not this is 100% valid or not according to historical methods of analysis is less important than what the story is teaching us. It's nice when we begin to get into the period of time when we have additional records, since most of the early days of the Bible, there are not a lot of surviving third-party records, and archaeology is only beginning to dig up more and more corroboration. But it is nice when we get to the end period of the Bible to see that there is at least plausible support for the story as a general outline. So what do we do on Purim to celebrate? How do we observe this holiday? What are the mitzvot? What are the commandments of this holiday? For those who want to know more about how this can be commanded when it comes after the Torah, first of all, this is the only non-Torah holiday that is still included in the Bible. But for more information on the establishment of holidays and the commandments that go with it, after the giving of the Torah in the time of the Exodus, I'll refer you back to my Hanukkah class, where we talked about the fact that the people were given the authority and indeed the responsibility of, from time to time, establishing commandments with the power that God had invested in them. We don't do this often, but Purim was the perfect candidate for this, as we'll see. So there are a few commandments, a few mitzvot associated with the holiday of Purim, 4 to be precise. 1, the reading of the Megillah, also known as Mikra Megillah. 2, the sending of gifts, called Mishloach Manot. 3, giving gifts to those that are poor on the holiday, Matanot le'Evyonim. And 4, the Purim feast, also known as Seudat Purim. We're going to go through each of these in detail, so as Purim comes up in just a couple weeks, you will know what to do. The reading. Everyone is obligated in the reading of the Megillah. Men, women, converts, slaves, everyone. Now, you might have thought that some of those wouldn't be obligated, in particular if you were a convert or slave, because maybe the story didn't really apply to you, either because you're not 100% free at the moment or because your ancestors were not there personally involved. However, no, it is there for all of us. A reminder, of course, that slavery that is being discussed in this particular section is indentured servitude and not the chattel slavery that was practiced in the New World. Children should also be trained to read it. Even Kohanim should neglect the temple service to come hear the reading of the Megillah. Now, that's a very big statement for Rambam, the great law code writer of the 1,000 years ago. But to say that the Kohanim would leave the temple to make sure they could hear the Megillah being read is an incredible statement of how important this is. This is not just about telling a fun story. This is a crucial part of retelling, recapturing, and reliving the emotional experience of the holiday. Now, the Megillah is read 2 times, both the evening as well as in the following morning. A reminder to those of you who might be new that Jewish holidays always begin at night because it was evening, it was morning. In the story of Genesis, we start with night, and so do our days start with night. It is considered that hearing the reading is the same as reading it yourself. And indeed, it is preferred if you can be part of a group, although there are special COVID limitations this year. But it is preferred to be part of a group during the chanting of the Megillah itself. And it is best to read from an official, proper scroll. That means a scroll written in almost every respect like a Torah scroll itself, but only containing the Book of Esther. If it's not possible, and indeed for this coming year it may not be possible for everyone to either be present in the room when the Megillah is being read or to have a scroll from which to read, it is okay to read from other versions of the book, that is to say printed books or digital books even, to be able to fulfill the commandment. It is preferred to read from the authentic scrolls, but it is not required, especially under special circumstances. And this year are very special circumstances. In fact, Purim was the last holiday we were able to celebrate communally before the lockdowns began last year during COVID. Now, the reading you may find a little difficult if you don't speak Hebrew. But again, the law code says, one who speaks a language other than Hebrew and hears the Megillah read in Hebrew, written in the Holy Script, fulfills his obligation, even though he doesn't understand what is being read. So hearing it is good enough, even if you don't comprehend it. Obviously, it's great if you have a translation so that you can read along in the meaning as well as the hearing. However, if it was written in Greek, he also fulfills his obligation, even if he does not understand. Greek had a special position because of the Septuagint, the special translation of Bible into Greek. It's not really relevant for most of us living here. If it is written in Aramaic, which was more like the English of the day, commonly spoken even when people didn't know Hebrew, or written in another language, one fulfills the obligation only if the language is understood. So if you are by yourself and you do not know how to read the text of the Hebrew on your own, you can still fulfill the obligation by reading the story of Esther in the English as your primary source. It's great to learn the Hebrew. It's great to be available for the Hebrew reading, but it does work if that is what is your best option at the time. Questions on the reading before we move on to the next topic? All right. So let's talk about the giving of gifts. Well, we see in the book of Esther itself that there is an obligation, there is a directive that she gives that people give gifts. And so a person is obligated to send 2 portions of meat, 2 other cooked dishes, or 2 other foods to a friend based on sending portions to one another from Esther chapter 9. This mitzvah is known as mishloach manot. If one does not have the means, meaning if you're not wealthy enough to be able to send food to other people, one should instead exchange meals with a friend. So Judaism understands that holiday shopping, in this case food shopping, should not break you. And if you lived in a time when food was much rarer and scarcer and harder to provide for yourself than it is today, then you could still fulfill this commandment by having two people, each of whom did not have much, simply swapping the dishes. That way, one is giving it to the other to eat, and the other is giving it to him to eat. Nobody goes hungry, and everybody is able to fulfill the mitzvah. It is just a great testament to how Judaism does not want people to impoverish themselves or be deprived of basic necessities like food in order to celebrate our holidays. There is always a way to make it work. Now, on the same day, we also give gifts to those that are poor. Now, this can overlap with the gifts to others that we saw in the last slide, but it can also be a gift that is given to someone else that is poor, that is not also receiving the food that was sent before. And indeed, it is nice, if possible, to give gifts to many people and to also give gifts to those that are absolutely in need of receipt. One is obligated to distribute tzedakah, often translated as charity, but not quite the same. We'll talk about that in a later class. One is obligated to distribute tzedakah to the poor on the day of Purim, on the day itself. At the very least, to give each of two poor people a present, whether it be money, cooked dishes, or other food based on gifts to the poor, the specific line taken again from Esther chapter 9. This mitzvah is known as matanot le'evyonim. We should not be discriminating, meaning you don't walk around to see who is the best poor person to give. Who do I like best? Who asked me the nicest? Who looks the most disheveled? Instead, we should give to whomever stretches out their hand. I know there's a phrase, beggars can't be choosers, but givers shouldn't be choosers either. That is to say, it is not our place to play the Lord of the Manor, deciding who is deserving and who is not. If they come to us, especially on the holiday of Purim, and we have the ability to help, we do and help. We don't ask for their tax forms and ID or anything else. We give and we help, and we don't worry about them having deceived us. If they're asking, that is sufficient. Now we come to everyone's favorite mitzvah, the part that everyone loves the best. You know, reading is nice, giving gifts is good, helping the poor, okay, but feasting, all right. So, what is the nature of our obligation for the seudah, for the feast? A person should eat meat and prepare as attractive a seudah, a feast, as his means permit. He should drink wine until he becomes drunk and falls asleep. Now, it's important to know a number of different points here, some of which I'll go into more detail, but I'm just going to give the surface explanation at the moment. That the eating of the meat was because this was a special time a person should save up to be able to have meat, because for most of our history, people did not have the ability, the money to buy meat every day. Most people would go weeks, if not months, without eating meat. And what this is saying is that if you are going to save up for meat, which was very, very important in terms of nutrition and calorie and health, if you were going to save up for a meat meal, make it the holiday. Make it this opportunity. Obviously, if you are a vegetarian, you are not obligated to eat meat. Having a meal, a seudah, that is as nice as you can make it is very important, especially with that phrase, as you can make it. We're going to come back to that in just a few minutes. The drinking of wine we will also talk about in more detail, but as the different stages of the holiday were marked by feasting and drinking, there is a reason why we let the wine flow during this holiday. But please understand that this mitzvah, this eating and feasting and drinking, is meant to happen during the daytime of Purim. So if Purim happens in the night, you go to the services, you read the Megillah, you go home, you sleep. The next day you wake up, you go to services. This year we're doing a community service. And then you go to your home, and now you have your feast, and now you drink. Unfortunately, many people drink to excess in the evening and then miss the next morning service. Or many people drink in the evening and then, God forbid, get in their cars and drive home. That is not what is supposed to happen. You are supposed to be drinking at your home with your feast, and then, as you can see, taking maybe a nap, but not going anywhere else after that. So please be responsible. But coming back to what does it mean to have a feast according to your means? Again, taken from Maimonides' words, Rambam from 1,000 years ago. It is better to be more liberal with their donations to the poor than to be lavish with their seudah or sending portions to their friends. So if you have to look at your budget and say, well, I've got $100 to make the holiday, I can spend $99 on my food and and also giving gifts to my friends that I like who don't really need it, and then I'll give $1 to somebody that's poor. That is not the way it is supposed to go. You're supposed to reverse that, not 1 to 99, but you are supposed to make sure that you are spending as much as possible to take care of others before you simply fill your stomach. There is no greater and more splendid happiness than to gladden the hearts of the poor, the orphans, the widows, and the converts. Converts were people who often did not have families and often didn't have family support during Jewish holidays because they were newly added to the community. So helping them to be able to celebrate was considered especially important. One who brings them happiness resembles the Shekhinah, meaning the presence of God, to revive the spirit of the lowly and to revive those with broken hearts, poetically interpreting Isaiah 57. So we focus on helping others, which will give us more happiness than just shoving another chunk of meat into our mouth or another glass of wine. When a person eats and drinks in celebration, but locks the gates of his courtyard and does not provide for the poor and bitter souls, his happiness is not the happiness of mitzvah, of commandedness, but the happiness of his gut. Such happiness is a disgrace, based on, from the prophet Malachi, I will spread dung on your faces, the dung of your feasts. The prophets, and Rambam in quoting, do not mince words. If you are having a jolly old time and you have forgotten everyone else in need, then you are not doing any service to God and you're not doing any service to your soul. Instead, all you are doing is filling your belly. And while that is perfectly fine, Judaism has no problem with being happy in what we eat. If you are doing it while neglecting those in need, then that is a major, major problem, especially on holidays where we are commanded to help those that are in need on that specific day. Questions or comments on this part of how we balance our budget when it comes to our feast? You guys are all very quiet tonight. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the drinking, because there's one thing that everybody seems to know about Purim, and that's that you're supposed to get drunk. It is amazing that people will forget the gifts to the poor. They'll even forget gifts to the friend, but people will remember that they're supposed to get drunk. I've had people who show up in synagogue having not been there for 20 years, and they remember drinking on Purim. Okay, so what's the deal? Why is drinking as a separate part of the feasting emphasized in the mind of so many? Well, because there is a story in the Talmud. Unfortunately, most people only remember the first half. So here is the full version. Said Rava, a man is obligated to drink on Purim until he no longer knows the difference between cursed Haman and blessed Mordechai. Now, that's basically saying that not only should you drink in a way that would normally bring happiness along with a meal and a feast, but you should continue drinking even more than that. But we get the next part of the story of what happens. Rabba and Rav Zera celebrated the Purim meal together. Oh, how nice. They got drunk. Okay, fine. Maybe that's what they were supposed to do according to the first opinion. Rabba arose and slaughtered Rabbi Zera. He actually killed the other guy, or at least mortally wounded him. The next day, he prayed and revived him. The following year, Rabba said, would the master, a polite way of talking to Rabbi Zera, would the master like to come and we will celebrate the Purim meal together? Rabbi Zera said to him, a miracle does not occur every hour. Meaning, are you crazy? I'm not going to count on God saving my life again. You murdered me last year. Right? This is not something that we just say, oh, it's okay. I'm sure God will resurrect me again or heal my wounds. No, you got too drunk. You committed a horrible, horrible crime. And thank God I'm still alive, but I'm not going to come to your party again when that's what you do when you drink too much. And indeed, that is the Jewish concept about drinking is that one should not drink so much that you become unable to control yourself. In case you wonder if that's just the prudish interpretation of a modern rabbi, we can look at numerous historical sources which give us a range of opinions, which, as you'll see, the majority of which do not say to drink to a murderous rage. So looking at the Bach, one is literally required to become so intoxicated that one can't tell the difference between the two phrases. It's the only way to explain the killing. Right? So he takes a fairly literal interpretation of the Talmudic idea. However, the Beit Yosef and the Tosafot, they say, instead, this means you should drink so much that you can't recite the full song. Cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai, cursed is Zeresh, blessed is Esther, cursed are all the wicked, blessed are the Jews. Interpreting basically that when we say you can't tell the difference between curses of Haman, blessed is Mordechai, it means you are now drunk enough that you have trouble remembering the words to a song. That is not so drunk that you would murder someone. That's just a little extra tipsy maybe than a usual one glass of wine at a meal sort of drinking. Indeed, they argue that the whole story of drink so much that you can't tell the difference in a literal fashion cannot be understood that way. The Aguda, another major source, says that you have to get so drunk that you can't do the gematria, and gematria is the Jewish version of Roman numerals, where you convert one letter to a number, and then by adding them up, you can convert them into a new word. And indeed, Arur Haman, cursed is Haman, and Baruch Mordechai, blessed is Mordechai, both have the same numerical value if you add up their letters, which is 502. Now, I can't do gematria that fast in my head, even when I'm stone sober. So this is not a very high bar of how much you need to drink. The Kolbo, he says, no drunkenness at all. Drink to a level where you are, feeling warm, but not anything that would be called true drunkenness, because when you're too drunk, you cause sin. After all, we just saw in the story in the Talmud somebody who got so drunk that it led very much to a very bad outcome. A little drinking, on the other hand, that can increase in making the poor joyful and comforted. Sfat Emet, again, just says it means to rejoice and drink continually, not about getting to a certain level, but you should continue your happiness and your joy maybe longer than a usual meal. The Ramah says that some say that drinking enough to put you to sleep is plenty, because if you're asleep, then you can't really tell the difference anymore either. And our final text at the bottom from the Mishnah Berurah says, like the Ramah above him, that we drink just enough to put ourselves asleep, but not enough that we would actually miss out on doing other mitzvot, on other commandments. Let's talk about the changes to our prayers. So we recite a special prayer in the Amidah, in our prayer service, and I'll talk about the Amidah in a later class. And the paragraph is called Al HaNisim, and it is a paragraph where we celebrate our victory. We also read it on the day of Hanukkah, or the days of Hanukkah. Now, we do not recite the collection of psalms known as Hallel, which I also mentioned in our discussion of Hanukkah, even though we normally do recite Hallel on joyous occasions that celebrate our victory and salvation, and thus on our major holidays. We don't recite it on Purim, however, because reading the Megillah is pretty much like reading Hallel. We are reading 10 chapters of the book of Esther. We are retelling the reason for our celebration. We don't really need to add another set of psalms. However, more poignantly, the victory that happened in the book of Esther wasn't a full victory. Yes, we weren't destroyed, but we were not truly liberated. We were still under Persian rule. It may have been a benevolent rule, but it was not true independence. And even more to the point, the victory didn't occur in our own land, in our own place. It didn't occur in the land of Israel. So Hallel is not recited on Purim. However, we make up for it in the things we eat. Hamantashen is the most identified treat on Purim. Of course, you can eat anything that is of pleasure to you on Purim, as long as it's kosher. Hamantashen are often called Oznei Haman, which literally means Haman's ears. And these are pastries, cookies kind of thing that usually have a fruit or other filling. Now, the origin of the Hamantashen, I hate to tell you, is not Persia. It is most likely from Central Europe during the 1700s. Why do we know that? Well, because a dough-filled pocket of poppy seeds was very popular in that time period, and indeed were called Montaschen, which is German for poppy pockets. It doesn't exactly take a genius to hear Montaschen and Hommentaschen. It is a play on words to take what would have been a popular treat and turn it into a holiday favorite. And thankfully, we have now more variety because I don't really care for the whole poppy filling. But it is still a wonderful treat to eat on Purim, and love them a lot. But like I said, other treats are fine if you have something else that you enjoy even more. One other thing that is well known is that many people wear costumes on Purim. Indeed, I'll be wearing a costume both in the evening and morning service during the reading of the Megillah. So since the miracle of Purim happened through hidden identities, nobody knew who Esther truly was, nobody knew her relationship to Mordechai, nobody knew that Haman was really a villain. Since everybody was sort of in mixed up roles, the idea of wearing a costume which changes your identity is very appropriate. Also, we see throughout the story that people's success or failures are usually marked by the changing of costumes. Somebody is adorned with special clothes, like Mordechai when he is honored, and somebody has those clothes taken off, like Mordechai when he is in mourning due to the impending doom that is about to happen. So the changing of clothes to represent different feelings and moods very much goes along with the story that we read in the book of Esther. And finally, another aspect that's very famous for most modern celebrations is that although we have private feasts that go along with our mitzvah, our seudot, many communities want to add to even more party atmosphere and also to help more people celebrate. And so there will be carnival with fun, with games that work for children and adults. Now this year we're having a very moderate type of celebration. We're actually making for our school children and school families Purim carnivals in a bag that people can take home with them in order to celebrate in a more COVID safe environment. But you can be sure that next year we are going to be out in full force to celebrate all together. So that is Purim in a nutshell. Questions or comments on this amazing holiday?
For the services, is that going to be on a Zoom link as well?
Yes, so the services this year are going to be held in person with social distancing, just like we do on a regular Shabbat. Services will also be live streamed through the regular live streaming link on our website. And since it is not Shabbat, we can engage with technology, and thus we will also have a Zoom link for the service as well, for those that would like to be part of the mosaic of all the different faces on the computer hookup.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right, do keep an eye on the emails from the congregation regarding the precise timing. We're just nailing that down now so that you'll know when our services are happening. Take care, everyone. Be well, and keep trying to find those moments of joy.